Welcome to the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson our topic is defense. Well, let's get to it and let's start with some endgames. The situation seems rather serious here for black, as the black bishop on a4 is in a pin. Well, is white threatening right now to actually use this pin? Well, not quite at the very moment, because if the white bishop would move to c6 to attack the bishop on a4 a second time, that bishop would be captured immediately with a check. And not only that, white wouldn't win, white would lose both pieces. Similar would be the problem if the white bishop instead would move to c2. Again, the black bishop would check on c6. Nevertheless, white has a threat, and namely just to move the king out of trouble to h2 and then indeed use these very same pins. And the situation seems kind of bad, because if, for example, the black rook right now would move to a1, then again not bishop c2 because of the discovered check with bishop c6, but one of the winning ideas is to play rook a6, attacking the pawn on f6, and when that pawn is being protected by the king, then already the white bishop can safely and successfully move to c2. If bishop captures, then obviously the rook hangs, and if bishop c6 check, then rook will take that bishop. So the point is that white does have threats, whether playing rook a6 or possibly playing king h2 and getting out of that potential check on the long diagonal. So the question is, how can black save himself? And I suggest that you try to figure it out on your own before you actually listen to the correct answer. The typical way to try to escape from such trouble is to play rook a2 with the obvious idea to then on the following move play bishop to b3, which would immediately unpin the bishop. The trouble seems to be, though, at first, that white right now would just attack the black rook and moreover also attack a second time black's pawn on f7, and white would be getting ahead. Quite miraculously, actually, this would not be achieving anything for white. Can you figure out what's the tricky move that black has planned here? Well, that impressive move is bishop going back to c6. It seems like everything is hanging, but actually the point is that the white bishop is pinned and is not able to capture the rook on a2. On the other hand, it is white now who has to be really careful not to lose, as if rook would capture on a2, bishop would capture on d5, and forking the king and rook, and black is the one who would be winning. So therefore, in this position, it is already white who has to make some fancy moves to save the game. And the only way to save the game right now is to play rook d7, protecting the bishop. If bishop takes rook, then white will do the same. If bishop takes bishop, obviously the bishop is protected. So the best black can do is give up the rook for the pawn and then capture white's rook on d7. However, this extra pawn that black has at the moment is obviously insufficient to make any progress, as all the pawns are on the same side, and on top of it black has doubled pawns on the f-file. So therefore, if white plays halfway decent, there is no way to create a passed pawn or to win the game for black. So therefore, this game is expected to end in a draw. In the actual game, after black played rook a2, white did not play bishop d5, but instead gave up hope on the pin and moved rook to b7, of course still with the idea and threat of playing bishop d5, but black could simply stop that plan, and he did so by playing rook d2, and the players agreed in a draw. A very fascinating endgame and a perfect example about pins. Let's move on to our second example in this lesson. Here we are. In this position, white is a bishop up. However, it's obvious that black has a super dangerous pawn on the c-file, which is about to get promoted. However, the catch is that white is also threatening to checkmate on the very next move on the back rank. As usual, my recommendation is, before you go further, you stop the recording for a few minutes and try to evaluate, calculate the position on your own, and only then listen further what the correct answers are. So if you look at this position from black's perspective, naturally the first thing to determine is that, okay, my opponent is about to give checkmate, what to do about it? One option is to try simply protect the square where my opponent wants to checkmate. Okay, so let's say you analyze that variation. Whether you like the results of that variation or not, you may look for other alternative options. And you certainly should be aware of your choices. Obviously, promoting the pawn right away is not a choice because that would allow the rook e8 checkmate. Let's first check out what may happen if black responds with a natural move such as rook c8. Well, that would not end well things for black, because white has a tricky way to make progress, namely playing rook e8, check, forcing black to capture, and naturally now not recapturing the rook, but playing f7 check, fork. King better moves to g7, so the f7 pawn does not promote by giving a check. Pawn captures and promotes to a queen, and black promotes as well. The problem is, however, with such situations that typically the side that starts giving the checks comes out ahead. And in this case, that is white. Queen f7 check. Now the black king has only one reasonable square to go to, as if it goes to the corner, the black king immediately would be get checkmated. So after king h6, the chase continues with queen h7, king g5, and h4. A new piece arrives to the attack. If right now the king moves to f4, the king and the queen would be on the same diagonal, and therefore white could win the queen right away with a skewer. If after h4 the king would move to g4, checkmate would arrive real quick with queen h5, king h3, queen f3, and after king takes pawn, back to h5, checkmate. Quite a nice variation. Let's go back just a couple of moves and look for a moment what happens after king f6. Then again the chase continues. King e5, queen e7. If king f4, queen g5 immediately would checkmate. And finally, after king d5, even though white does not win the black queen, neither does white give a checkmate immediately, but white achieves the next best thing, and that is to trade the queens with queen g5, forcing the exchange of the queens. And the important part right now is that the white pawn is no longer on the h file, because remember, while that pawn was on the h file, it had the famous wrong corner problem, meaning that the white bishop is of opposite color than white's pawn's promotion square is, and therefore as long as the black king gets anywhere near there, like f6 or g7 or h8 obviously, the game would be an automatic draw. However, if we are not talking about a rook pawn, like here, the pawn moved from the H file to the G file, then none of those issues are in the picture, and therefore white has a rather simple win. So let's go back all the way to the beginning. And now that we know that rook c8 pretty much loses by force, let's see what other alternatives we may have. And there aren't much choices because white is about to checkmate. So typically, kind of by method of elimination, we would look at moves that would involve something very forceful, and most typically a check. The correct move here, the only move that saves the game, is to play rook f5, which of course seems like a sacrifice. However, in reality, once the white bishop would capture black's rook, all of a sudden the checkmate threat is gone and black can safely promote the c-pawn. For example, bishop takes rook, pawn promotes to a queen, and now it is white who needs to watch out and be careful not to lose, and the best way to achieve that is try to get the king and the bishop close to each other so there wouldn't be any forks. For example, playing king g3, so for example a forking attempt could be saved with bishop g4. On the other hand, if white would try to win immediately by going back to the same threat with bishop g4, that would be a mistake because black would succeed to create a fork by checking the white king and eventually also a second piece real soon. For example, queen f4. If the king moves to a light square to e2 or g2, queen g4 immediately would achieve that. So white is trying to stay on the dark squares as long as they can. Queen h4, king d2, queen b4. And at this stage, white is in trouble because anywhere the king moves, black will succeed giving a fork. So let's go back all the way. And we already determined that rook f5 so far worked pretty well. We saw what happens if the white bishop captures the rook and black simply gets to promote the pawn. The relatively best choice for white right now is moving out of that check and maintaining the threats of checkmating on the back rank as well as capturing the rook on f5. Now black doesn't have the time to promote the pawn, however can still save the game by another rook sacrifice. Rook captures pawn. Again, the point is if rook captures rook, the pawn can already promote as there is no longer an existing checkmate threat. So the best that white can do is check. And now black still needs to be careful because if the king moves out of the check and the bishop captures on c2, there are still a lot of challenges to save the game. The best move right now is, very importantly, to force the exchange of the rooks. White has no choice but get to trade the rooks. And again, here we are in a bishop and rook pawn with the wrong color corner, which is a theoretical draw. As I mentioned earlier, the black king is easily reaching the promotion square and that corner, so therefore white cannot make any progress. A very instructive endgame played by Grandmasters Dreyev and Yudasin. Let's move on to our next example, which in contrary to the previous examples is from a middle game and not an endgame. In this position that was reached in a game, white has a mating attack. We can tell that the white queen and bishop are very effective in trying to create a simple checkmate with queen e7. On the other hand, we can also tell that black is a rook up, although white has couple pawns for it, but nevertheless a rook is a rook. However, that will only count if black can escape from the deadly checkmate threat. So what may be black's escape route? As we know, one way to handle a threat is to simply trying to guard that very square, namely in this case e7. Another method could be to try to eliminate one of the two white pieces that cooperate in this plan, namely the white bishop on d6 or the queen on f6, by forcing that exchange or succeeding in capturing it. However, none of those are realistic options. So therefore, the only thing that's left for black, looking for some forceful moves, and we're only talking about checks in this case, because otherwise white would be ready to checkmate immediately. So if we are talking about checks, there is really only one option that comes to mind, and that is to immediately sacrifice the rook on g2. Now, with a little bit of calculation, it's not hard to figure out that black would be doing excellent after king takes rook, since the black queen then would move to g4, forking the white king and rook. And what's even more important, that if now the white king moves out of the check to the first rank, the black queen will capture the rook right away with a check, and then even capturing white's bishop on d6. So white would lose all the important pieces. And if the bishop would block on g3, then for one, there is no longer any checkmate threat, and black has already many ways to win, but the best, most efficient way is to play bishop c6 check, and then on the next move capture the rook on d1. However, the game continued differently. You may wonder, how can it continue differently? Well, after rook g2 check, white played a tricky move by simply moving to the corner, maintaining the checkmate threat on e7, and by the way, that rook is kind of hanging there for later. Capturing on h2 a second time to sacrifice the rook wouldn't lead anywhere, as after king captures rook, there are no more decent checks for black, and it would be time to resign. However, black came up with an excellent saving plan, namely giving the check on g1. Now we already know that if the king captures the rook and the king gets to the g-file, black's counterattack succeeds after the queen g4 check, and black will succeed in capturing the white rook on d1 with a tempo with a check. So therefore, the only thing white can try is to capture back with the rook. The problem with this scenario is that the white king is cornered, and there are unpleasant surprises with the bishop c6 check. And now white can avoid losing only by playing f3, and now black still needs to be very careful, because immediately capturing the bishop on d6 would be suicidal, allowing checkmate in just 2 moves. Voila, here it goes. However, black can do better than that, namely by clearing some space for the king, and first sacrificing the bishop. And on one hand now, of course, the queen needs to retreat, in addition to clearing space on c6 for the black king, but more importantly that we pulled away the attacking hand of the white queen, and now it was safe to capture the white bishop on d6, and the position is about equal, with 4 pawns each and equal material. What an amazing escape for black. And let's see one more example on this theme of escaping a hard-looking situation. The next example has been played between Grandmasters Nataf and Tony Miles. In this position, the problem seems to be that if white trades rooks, which is the obvious thing to do, then after that black will win the b5 pawn right away? Well, the only other option is to protect our rook. Capturing on b3 wouldn't work out well because black takes back, king a2, rook b5, for example rook c1, protecting the pawn, and now the black king would get closer to attack our pawn. White pushes, rook b8, c7, rook c8. And now the white king can start running. Knight f6, king a4, king h6, rook c6, and now black best off gives up the knight and put all eggs in one basket by taking the pawn and counting fully on the prospects of the g-pawn. Now capture the pawn on c7, and the important part is the white king is being cut out from the other side of the board, and the g-pawn will easily progress with the help of the black king. So as we saw, the rook takes b3 doesn't quite work out. On the other hand, protecting the rook with rook g2 is much better. And now black continued with knight f6. And now there are already numerous ways to draw. One would be to trade rooks right away, then get out of the check and capture the pawn on g5. White played differently by playing b6 right away. Black played knight e4, and white was now ready to trade, attacking the rook on b3, and now attacking the knight. Once the knight moves, obviously the pawn on g5 falls. So at this stage, black actually settled for repetition of moves, kept giving checks on b1 and c3, and the grandmasters agreed in a draw. And now, finally, let's see the jewel of the week. And here we go. In this position, black clearly has the material advantage, still having their queen on the board, also having an extra pawn. And yet, quite amazingly, it is white who can win the game. I suggest you take your time and try to figure out what is the winning sequence. Even though in this position black has a whole bunch of squares available for their king, actually the black king is getting into serious trouble real soon. The first move in the sequence is to play e5, an amazing move. Just in one move, white took away all of those 4 squares to which in the past move the king could have easily gone. So therefore, white is threatening right now to give checkmate with b4. Well, that's all nice and beautiful, but what if the pawn simply captures? Now if b4, the king will simply run back to d6. And now in the meantime, black has increased their material advantage, having 2 extra pawns. Okay, but white did all of this intentionally, and now plays knight e4 check. The point is that if the black king moves either to the 4th rank anywhere or captures the pawn on d5, the white knight will end up on f6, attacking the black queen and checking black's king. So therefore, the only response not to lose right away is to move the king to b5. And how can white make progress now? Amazingly, with a quiet and peaceful move. b4. What a beautiful move. Again threatening to checkmate in 1 by playing knight c3. A beautiful move. If the king captures the pawn on b4, then again discover check, knight f6, and white wins. Therefore, black played differently, king a4, trying to run away. But white puts a stop to that running away real quick by playing king b2, and again renewing the threat of checkmating with knight c3. And finally, black has no way to avoid losing the queen or getting checkmated. For example, king b4, knight f6, and discovered check, and the queen is falling. A very nice composition by Kubel. I hope you enjoyed these examples of defense as well as the beautiful endgame, the jewel of the week. Thanks for listening, and so long until next week. Bye bye.